So my name's Brandon Boswell. I've used Laravel for a little bit. Initially in Laravel 3, did a talk about moving from Laravel 3 to Laravel 4. I built a fairly decent sized Laravel site at content.com over the last 18 months, where we basically started as a static Laravel site, and then we slowly moved things over to Angular. And that's kind of the impetus of what I'm going to talk about tonight is so many people talk about Angular, they're always talking about single page apps. But there's actually a couple different approaches you can take, and we'll go into that. Awesome. So who has used Angular before in some way, shape, or form? Awesome. Cool. So most of you, and in general, most people talk about Angular in a single page site perspective. So the idea is you have a client-side JavaScript app where basically you have a JavaScript API, and then Angular basically drives all of your UI. And that's cool. It works great. But the only thing is, it's kind of extreme. Like, you can't exactly tell your boss that today we're going to take everything we had and we're going to throw it away and we're going to start a client-side JavaScript app. And you kind of have to be all in and really committed, and it's not exactly the easiest thing in the world to convince your boss of. So a different perspective that doesn't really get a lot of credit is actually the concept of a multi-page Angular site, or the idea of just having static pages with Angular components on them. And that's kind of what I want to talk a little bit about tonight. You can basically take a more simple approach where you swap out small components of your site that, basically take the most important parts and then dip your toe in, try it out. And it's a lot easier to get started. You don't have to basically say, we're going to scrap everything and start over. So that was the shortest presentation in the world, and we're going to actually do some demo. So, what's that?
Yeah, that was good.
Done. You know everything you need to know about Angular now. Okay, let's kill this. And that will work. Okay, cool. So we have this super duper simple Laravel site. And basically what it allows you to do is to search Twitter for Laravel users around the world by location. So basically we pull this from Twitter, we're going to throw it in the database and hang on to it, and then from here what we can do is we can actually search for a specific place. So let's see if there's any Laravel devs in Arkansas. Oh, there is one. And this is cool. It's a good start. However, I do a search, and I press enter, and I wait a second, and then I get results. And it's a decent start, but it's not exactly the best user experience in the world. So realistically, how you'd probably want this to work is basically as you type, get results in real time. And basically what we're doing is we're simulating a site that you already have. You have some basic static functionality that was relatively easy to get to. And then you go, I want this to be a little bit better. I want this to be over and above what we can do with static. And rather than scrap everything and start over with a client-side JavaScript app, what we can actually do is we can actually just take this one section and power it up with Angular. And especially if you have an existing site that's been around for a couple of years, swapping out the whole thing is not really something that you can do. So let's jump into the code. We'll do a quick kind of intro into what we've got. So we've got some routes. So this user's controller is basically what we're using. Here's the root route that actually drives all this. Let's throw up that user's controller. Bam, we have an index method. We're sleeping for a second to simulate the real world. And then we're going to boot up this user search service that's basically going to search our backend for users. So we're going to pass in our input, in this case, a query parameter. So let's show that real quick. So if you look up here, query equals Chicago. So that's going to get passed back into that service. So let's hop over to user search service. Okay, we're going to take in some data. And we only want 10 results. And then we're going to just do a really simple query. Then we're going to return the results back to the controller. Everybody with me? Relatively straightforward? Cool. All right, and then our user controller, we have a view, user's index, pretty straightforward. So let's pull in Bootstrap. Let's pull in some basic styles. We've got a header. And then we've got our user search component that lives right in here. So little form with some search, and then we're going to loop over the results if there are any. If there aren't any, we're going to tell the user that there weren't any. Good? Pretty straightforward. Cool. Let's get started actually converting this over to Angular. So one of the other things that I wrote that's kind of cool, it's this thing called Angular Booter. And basically what it allows you to do is to basically create an object at the top of your page, and then anywhere in your views or subviews, register different Angular components with it. So register controllers, services, directives, factories, any of that stuff anywhere in your subviews. And then at the bottom of your page, boot it, and they all play well together and they all talk together. But they're not dependent on each other. It allows you to kind of take advantage of what Laravel has with Blade, partials, and also be able to reuse some of these components in multiple places. So we're going to use this as part of our workflow as well. Okay, so let's hop back in. So the first thing we need to do is we need to actually bring in Angular. So let's go script tag, source equals, and let's pull in, bam, sweet. Okay, now we've got Angular. And let's also bring in our booter. Let's see, where are you? Public JS. Yeah, cool. Sweet. Let's make sure I know what I'm talking about. Yes. So Angular Booter is basically just an object that we can load at the top of our page that lets us register Angular components on demand, so that we only have to register the things that we're going to use on this page, and then we can also later make these individual components talk to each other across multiple pages. And I'll go into it a little bit. You don't have to worry about it just yet. Okay, cool. So we have Angular Booter. Let's jump back over and make sure we're not blowing up. Ta-da! All is well. Okay, so now let's actually create the Angular Booter. So let's just say window.myapp equals new Angular Booter. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new instance of that class that we just brought in, and we're going to tell it what we want to call our app. We're going to call it myapp. So let's now, if any of you guys have used Angular before, you've heard of ng-app. Basically, it tells Angular what aspects of the page it can touch. So basically, Angular will be able to touch anything deeper than this. So let's just throw on the body tag. Bam, we'll try this. It's going to blow up. It's going to tell us that basically you haven't created your app yet. So let's fix that. So now at the bottom of the page, we can basically take that myapp object that we created from Angular Booter, and let's boot it. And bam, life is good. Angular's happy. We haven't done anything, but everything's good. And also in this console, you'll get that we booted our dependencies, our services, our directives, our controllers, any configuration, and our filters. In this situation, we don't have any yet, but that's okay. So let's move on. Cool. So now let's actually prove that, let's get a controller running and actually prove that Angular is working. So let's just do ng-controller equals users search controller. Bam. Again, Angular's going to get mad. It says, I don't know what you're talking about. All right, let's add it. So basically, rather than go to the end of the page, we can actually just do this inline. So let's grab this user search controller, and then just after it, let's open up some script tags. And we're basically going to say myapp.controllers. And we're going to call this users search controller. And it's a function. So every controller in Angular is just a function that gets called and manages scope. So let's just say console.log, hola, is it working? And bam, we got hola. Okay, so we now have a controller in Angular. Let's just, to prove it, let's create a message and Cinco. You know, the funny thing is I actually use hola as my test message all the time. It just so happens that I'm actually giving this talk on Cinco de Mayo, which is hilarious. Okay, so in Angular, we can basically do these double curly braces to do two-way binding and basically have whatever is talked about in the controller in Angular actually be represented on the screen. So yeah, let's screw it up first. Bam. Uh-oh. Yeah, so Blade also uses those. So what we can do is we can actually just throw an @ in front of it, and that will cancel it out. And bam, we have a message that doesn't work because it doesn't need that. What's the problem now? How did I break it?
need to put scope in the function down there and use the session controller?
Oh yeah, I have to import scope. Thank you guys. So thank you. This is the shit that doesn't happen when you're doing it on your own. It does happen when you're in front of people. So basically, Angular actually has dependency injection just like Laravel, and so basically we can do it just like we do in Laravel. So we can tell Angular that we want an instance of a service that Angular knows about. In this case, scope is a service that Angular ships with, but we could also register our own services. So now that we have scope, bam, we have Synco. But let's go ahead and do it right. So every controller is actually a function, but if we were to minify this, scope would no longer be called scope. So if you did like an uglify, it could be called A or B or whatever letter it wanted to be, and then Angular doesn't know what to inject. So the way we get around that is Angular has this really beautiful array syntax, and basically what we can say is this first argument is scope. And that way, if it minifies, minification is not actually going to change the value of an array. So if we go back,
So that specifically to make sure it doesn't fail on minification.
That's the only reason you need it. If you don't minify, you could not do it, but I recommend always doing it. Okay, so we indeed do have Synco. So let's actually move on. So scope is this really interesting Angular thing, allows two-way data binding, and basically what happens is anytime I make a change to this, it'll get updated inside of Angular. It'll also get updated inside the view. So let's now talk about, let's create a scope variable to hold users. So scope.users equals an empty array. And then basically what we'll do is we'll later populate this with something. And then let's also tell Angular to talk to this input. So ngModel is how we can do that. And basically what it'll do is it'll tie the value of this input to a scope variable inside of Angular. So let's just call this search query. And then if we were to hop over here, we can say scope.searchQuery. And then if we want, we can even pass in a default. And then now if we come back, refresh please. Bam, default. And then if we change this, it's also going to get changed in Angular. So let's prove that. So let's just inspect this element. So scope is actually tied to the DOM element. So let's actually grab this controller, and then we can do this kind of nifty thing. Let's say ang_scope. And we can basically say Angular and then pass in an element and ask for the scope of that element. And basically, there's this $0. Does anyone know what that $0 does? It's kind of a nifty little browser trick. $0 is whatever element you have selected in WebTools. So I highlight ng controller, I come over here and I say give me the scope for $0. Bam, magic. And then if I go and look at my search query, it is indeed this.
I have seen other developers in the controller just do window.scope equals scope. And that way, the scope object is tied to the window, and then in the console, they could just...
You could do that, but you'd have to tie it to a specific element. So you still have to find some way to get the element, and then do that. Because a scope, so scope starts at the window object really, really high, and then it can become more granular as you go down lower. So you would want to do it as low as possible to make sure you're getting access to everything. But yeah, so this is a nifty little trick. If you ever forget like how to do it, yeah, I create a snippet for it because I can't remember that, but I end up using it all the time. There's also this thing called AngularJS that does a similar thing. It's probably going to break everything. But you can see values in here as well.
It's a Chrome plugin.
It's a Chrome plugin. So yeah, just go to the Chrome store. It's called AngularJS. This is a similar thing. It's a little finicky, but it's really nice for debugging. Okay, so bam, it is indeed tied. We're in good shape. Okay, so now let's go in, and if you notice when we type in here, we get this little autocomplete, and that's kind of annoying. So let's get rid of that. So we'll just say autocomplete equals off. Bam. And okay, so now we have a scope variable tied to this. Let's now trigger some action whenever this changes. So we can say ng_change, and basically what it's going to do is anytime this model would change, it's going to perform some function that we say. So let's perform a search. and we're going to pass in the current value of this element. And obviously that function doesn't exist. Let's go create it. Bam. And we're going to take a query as a parameter, and Ariba. Why not? And pass in the query. Okay, let's try it again. And bam! Cool. It's now doing stuff. Sweet. All right, now let's actually do some search. Scope dot, let's say, get search results from server. And it's going to take a function. We're going to give it a query. Basically, we're going to do something. In this case, we want to actually talk to our backend. And lucky for us, we have a route just for that. So API/v1 user search is actually going to use user's API controller. And it's going to use that same search service that we use in our controller. And that's going to basically return JSON results back to us. Okay, so let's figure out how to talk to it. So Angular, a lot like it has scope, it also has a service for just doing HTTP requests. So let's do that. So first thing we have to do is we have to import the service. And we'll pass it in here. A nifty thing is you can actually call this anything you want. So let's call this HTTP Day of the Dead. I don't know. We can call it whatever we want. And because we're telling it what thing we want here, we can call it whatever we want. So we can actually namespace our own things. So like if I know a guy who actually takes jQuery and he injects jQuery to make sure that he's talking to the specific version of jQuery that he wants to. And he'll just do this. He'll just say like $J. But basically you can inject anything this way and it works really well. So now that we have HTTP Day of the Dead, we can now talk to our backend. And it has this get method that basically does an HTTP get to whoever we tell. So let's send it to API v1 users search, and then we need to basically pass over whatever the query is so it knows what to do. So it supports this config object that we pass in as the second parameter, and one of the things that that accepts is a params object. And in that params object, let's just pass in the query, and we'll call it query. Bam. So let's return this. So another nifty thing that Angular has that you may or may not have used is the concept of promises. Anyone ever use promises? Okay, they will like open your eyes. Like it was like, it took me a little while to get it, and then I got it and I was like, oh my god, this is great. So basically what a promise does is it's exactly what it says. It's a promise of some future thing. But basically you hold a reference to it, and then whenever that thing comes true, it'll actually perform an action. So in this case, let's say we want to talk to our scope.get search results from search. We're going to pass in our query. And then the cool thing about promises is they have the option to pass, to call then on them. And basically what happens is when the data comes back from the server, it's going to call this then function. And then we can basically do whatever we want in here. So let's just throw a function as the callback. It's going to return a response and HTTP status if we want. And then basically what we want to do is we want to update that scope.users property with the result. So we say response.data. So here, just out of curiosity, let's just grab Postman and let's say HTTP. Any of you guys use Postman? Oh, it's amazing. Find a dev. Yes, with dashes. API v1 user search. Bam. Hey, JavaScript. Sweet. So yeah, we know it indeed actually works. Okay, so let's try this out. Let's see if it screws up. Chicago. Okay. All right. Let's see if it gave us anything useful. We got users. Sweet. Okay, let's see if Angular knows about them. Ang scope. Sweet. Come on. Bam. Users. We have 2 users. Awesome. We're now talking. Okay, cool. So now let's start swapping out some of this blade code. Okay, so where do we start? We don't need this message. Let's get rid of this. We actually want a regular search. Okay, so now we can basically start swapping out the stuff. Actually, before we do that, instead of users being an empty array, let's actually put some data in here. So basically what we can do is we can say, okay, we want Blade to do something. We're getting this users property back from Angular. Let's convert it to an array. And let's also JSON encode the results. Basically,
To array is Angular.
Laravel. Sorry. This is what happens when you jump and do both. Okay, so now we're basically taking the users that were passed into the controller, results, and then we're going to pass in the results as user into the view, and then users index is basically going to have access to the user's object that was returned back from the search. Cool. Okay. So now what we can do, let's start converting over this stuff. So let's start with, let's get rid of this if we have users. And if we don't have users. And we're going to replace them with their Angular counterparts. And we're basically going to say show this list if there are users. So ng show if we have users. Great, that's easy. And let's now show this. Well, let's hide this if there are users. So basically we'll see this if there aren't users, we'll see this if there are. Let's watch it blow up. Cool, doesn't blow up, but we haven't converted anything over yet. So let's actually get rid of the for each. This is where it starts to get interesting. Okay, so Angular also has its own kind of for each. It's called ng repeat. And it's a little backwards. Instead of saying like users in blah, you say ng repeat user in users, where users is in scope. And okay, we're going to repeat this. We're going to call it user. So let's see. This is going to blow up. Great, undefined variable user. Yeah, we would expect that. So now let's convert the rest of this Laravel code over to Angular. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these opening braces. We're going to swap them out with their commented Angular ones. Everyone with me there? So that will basically escape out the blade template and use Angular instead. And then we also need to convert all of these fun arrows over to dots. Because JavaScript's cool like that. Let's see. And then the last little thing we have to do is basically what happens is there's a split second before Angular actually kicks in. And if you have a image tag, it's actually going to try and find this URL. And obviously that's not a real URL, but Angular has a fix for that. We use ng source, and basically what happens is it'll wait until that thing actually exists before it actually goes to the server to try and find it. So if you ever have a bunch of 404s on your backend server and you're wondering why, if you're using Angular, that's probably why. Flip back over. Ah, ta-da! We have stuff, and it's not made by Laravel. It's made by Angular. So let's try this out. Chicago, yay. Seattle, yay. London, yay. Washington, yay. So now we have this running. What's that?
A little bit biased there.
What's that? I didn't do it. This is what Twitter said. So, but yeah. So now this is completely running only in Angular, and the rest of our site is running in Laravel. Our site could be huge. We could have multiple components on this page and have just this running in Angular. And let's do one last step. Let's actually, this is kind of the beauty of Angular Booter, is let's take this component and let's actually throw this into, we don't need that last little div. Let's actually throw this into a partial. So we'll say view make, and then we're going to pass in partials, and then user search. Obviously that doesn't exist. Actually, hold tight. I do need that last little brace. Boom. This is cool. Okay, now we're good. And now let's go ahead and create that partial. So views, new file, partials / user search .blade.php. Bam. And okay, the only last little bit is we need to make sure we pass in that user property. So with users, and hopefully, if my life is good, it will still work. And now basically what I could do is I could use that user search component anywhere on my site. And the beauty of it is Angular Booter is actually going to register it on the fly. So you don't even have to tell it to do it. You just throw the component in, it's going to work. Because it's registering it with this global object that we created at the top. You could actually namespace this under your app. So like if you wanted to create, let's say window dot, let's say FAD, which is for find a developer, and just create an empty object. And then we could do window.fad.myapp if you're worried about polluting the global namespace. But so yeah, so that's at a basic level how you can basically say in an afternoon, I want to add Angular components to my site, not have to ask your boss, not have to throw away everything you have, and basically take individual pieces of your site that need some additional love and basically do that on the fly. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's it. Any questions? What's that?
Do you have a preference over HTTP versus a resource?
Depends on what I'm doing. So I've not really used resource a lot. I've used HTTP a lot, and I've used REST Angular a lot. HTTP just gives you a ton of flexibility. If you ever have to like fall away from convention, resource really kind of falls down. So
I don't have a preference. I'm just starting.
Either REST Angular or HTTP is kind of where I normally dabble. But no, I mean, as long as you can make your requests and you can use the promise, it comes in really handy. I don't know if I really like talked about this really deeply, but the really, really awesome part about promises is that you don't have to do callback hell. You can basically create a service. Let's actually look at this real quick. You can basically create a service that does a very specific thing. All this does is goes to the server and returns back results. And typically what you'd have to do in Node or just anything else, you would have a second parameter that would be a callback. And then this function has to know way too much. It basically has to know to call the callback. If you ever need to nest more than one callback, it's going to be really, really painful. But the beauty of this is I can say, do this, then do this, and then I could even say, when that's done, then do something else, and change it as far as I want. And each function really only still has to know how to do one thing really well, which lets me abstract this stuff. So I don't really have like a demo associated with this, but one of the really interesting things that we figured out at Content is that if we took all of these things that interact with the server and then we wrapped them in a service, an Angular service, and registered it with Angular Booter, we could actually use that anywhere in our site now. And we only ever have to create that information once. So we could learn how to create a user, how to update a user, how to delete a user, how to activate a user, how to email a user. And we do that all in a service, and the controller doesn't have to care anymore. It just calls the service method to handle it. Just like you would in a backend app, you could also do in a front-end app to basically allow you to create things very, very quickly. So yeah, throw questions whenever you want. I'll show a couple other things. So one way we could improve this is by adding some animations. Out of the box, Angular's a little janky. Like it's gonna jump every time I do something, which isn't much fun. So this little Year of Moo article is really good. It talks about how to basically have Angular use CSS animations to basically streamline how it loads to the browser. So at Content we use that. So like in our delivery engine, where you're choosing media companies to deliver to, we use something very, very similar to what I just wrote. And we can basically say, show me media companies in Richmond. And it's going to go to the server and it's going to find out. And then when it gets back, it's going to return the results. And basically that animation drives all of it. That way, as I type, it's not like jumping back and forth and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Creates a really streamlined, really smooth user interface. London, it's going to animate the search. When it's done, it's going to unanimate. Boom. So that kind of streamlines everything. Does anyone have questions about Angular Booter and like what it does? Did I kind of like get into that at all?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah? No?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out exactly what it does.
Okay, so it's really, really simple. Let's actually jump into the code. It's crazy simple. Basically what it is, it's an object. Or actually it's a function that returns an object. And basically it gives you a place to hold all the different things that Angular can use to boot. So you can register config objects, controllers, directives, dependencies, filters, services. But what happens normally is you have to manage all these things. But basically all you have to do is create an instance of Angular Booter at the top of your scaffold. So does everyone use like a scaffold in their Laravel sites that has like their main outer wrapper of their site? They swap out subviews. Register Angular Booter in your scaffold and boot it at the bottom of your scaffold. And then anywhere in your site, you can do anything with Angular you want, and you don't have to do anything. It's just going to boot automatically with all the dependencies it needs, nothing it doesn't need. And that way, because like in a lot of single page apps, what happens is you'll basically boot every dependency your site uses on any given page. And what this allows you to do is boot only dependencies that you're using on the given page that you're on. And they can talk to each other, but they don't have to know that each other exist. So they're loaded at compile time, and then they use each other if they have them. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to create an Angular module. If you're familiar with Angular, this is going to look really familiar. It's going to call it what we called the new instance, and it's going to accept dependencies. And this dependencies variable is just an array. So basically you could add anything to this array that you want. You can add scope to it, you can add HTTP to it, you can add REST Angular to it. Anything that you could register with Angular, you just add to this array, and it's going to get booted at boot time at the bottom of your page. Let's see. Do the same thing with services. So we're going to loop over these services, and we're going to boot them with Angular. Let's see. We're going to boot all of our directives, all of our controllers, and then we're finally going to boot our config, filters, and then we're done. So yeah. So I mean that's how Angular Booter works.